All right, this is Cadet Rob 1985, and this is going to be the first video that I do for my new channel, and it's going to be about the U.S. Army enlisted ranks. And just as a little background, I was a military brat for 20 years. My dad was in the Army for that entire time. He's a Vietnam era vet, and we traveled around the world. And I got interested, because of my dad's service, in military insignia and heraldry and devices and all that good stuff. So, all right, so let's begin. So the first chevrons that I can find any evidence of, it appears that up until this time, there really weren't any uniform marks for enlisted soldiers. There wasn't any designation on their uniforms that I can tell up until about the Mexican War era. Prior to that, the soldiers, the Army was so small, and that the individual soldiers knew who their corporals or sergeants were, and most soldiers were private soldiers anyways. There wasn't a professional non-commissioned officers corps or anything like that in the Army prior to that time. But at some point in the 1800s, and my research has shown 1858 is the time that I could find, that they instituted the ranks that many of them have stayed throughout till the present day. So you can see there's the different colors: blue for infantry, yellow or gold for cavalry, red for artillery, and then eventually green for the sharpshooters. That comes in around the time of the Civil War. And these stripes would continue, these chevrons would continue through the Civil War time period. And so, the chevrons are inverted from what we know today, more similar to British soldiers' chevrons, which was where I'm sure the pattern, the idea came from. And so you have the corporal with 2 chevrons and sergeants with 3. And then a company quartermaster had one straight one above his sergeant's chevrons. And then a first sergeant had a lozenge or a diamond, and then an ordnance sergeant had a star, and then finally you had regimental quartermaster sergeant and a regimental master sergeant. So, going into the next period, around 1872 to 1892, the chevrons really don't change very much. The same basic pattern follows through, but they become a little smaller and more rounded. And the stripes are not as thick, much thinner stripes. But the same color pattern continues right up until World War I. Now, World War I, up until World War I, these same kind of chevrons that you see now, they are more like what we would know today, pointing up instead of down. But the chevrons themselves were in the different colors of the various, branches: infantry, cavalry, artillery, etc. And there were many others, including hospital corps and several others. But when the war breaks out, the necessity of brown stripes on a brown uniform becomes pretty clear, and so all of the stripes change to kind of a drab, brownish color, subdued color on their uniforms. And so you finally have the first institution of a single stripe, which, interesting enough, is not a private. It is a lance corporal, and then you have corporal sergeant. The company level supply sergeant has still got that solid line instead of a rocker. The sergeant first class has the single rocker, then first sergeant with the diamond, color sergeant, and now with the star. So that changes a little bit. And then you have the battalion sergeant major, the regimental supply sergeant, and the regimental sergeant major. And you also have the battalion supply sergeant. All right, and then there were also, for many soldiers, there was specialty marks that were underneath, worn with their stripes, such as the band ones here, but there were many, many other ones similar to like what the Navy has, but you just not going to have room to show them all. But you have a band corporal, band sergeant, and then assistant band leader and band leader. Okay, so in the 1920s, after the war is over, you have this strange, unauthorized private first class, and it came in 6 different grades of private first class, or specialist marks. And so this apparently was a common, unauthorized method of denoting various specialties, and it's kind of the beginnings of what would later on become the specialists marks. But it was completely unauthorized. It only happened during the interwar years. I include it here just as a curiosity. So then during that post-war era from 1920 to 1941, the chevrons, they wanted to simplify the system, and so they reduced the number of ranks, and I'm sure this is why the specialist private first class marks. And so you notice the lance corporal becomes a private first class, and then a corporal, a sergeant, staff sergeant now, which is the way it looks today. The staff sergeant was single rocker. And then you have a technical sergeant, which is what nowadays would be a sergeant first class. And then the first sergeant with the diamond or lozenge. And then the master sergeant. So it's a much more streamlined, with 7 grades, from private to master sergeant. And that would hold up until the war. So then during World War II, you see the stripes become a little lighter in shade, and then you have your private first class through master sergeant. But you also have your technical grades, your technician 5th grade, 4th grade, and 3rd grade, to match their pay grade. So from grade 1 down to grade 5, and that's what you see with this. Okay, so after the war in 1949, they tried this strange kind of 2 tiers of stripes, blue on gold and gold on blue stripes. Didn't last but for 2 years. It's called the Mamie Eisenhower stripes, and I had never even heard of them until I started doing this research. It's kind of interesting, but this would be the early Korean War era, and I'd never seen them ever in any books that I'd read about the subject or anything like that. But I guess it was such a quick experiment that it doesn't really make a lasting impression. They were hated, apparently, and because it separated the combatants from the non-combatants, and so you have the blue on gold, which was the combat arms, and then the gold on blue, which were non-combat soldiers, or supposedly non-combat soldiers. But that didn't last. So then by 1952, you have the late Korean War era, where you have 2 grades with no insignia, recruits and privates. Both have no insignia, and then private first class. And then one of the things that is strange about this era that most people wouldn't even know is that they got rid of the 3-stripe sergeant, and they went to the sergeant, which looks like a staff sergeant of today. And this would last throughout the rest of the 1950s. So fans of the TV show MASH would be surprised to know that many of the characters who were sergeants wearing 3 stripes in that show, those stripes are just not correct. And I'm not really sure why they would get rid of that grade, but it lasts all the way through 1964. even into the 1970s, the end of the 1950s is when they restored the sergeant in 1959. So, in the middle of the Korean War, or at the very post end of the Korean War, they add these new specialists. This is what I'm pretty sure they were trying to do way back here with these, yellow, gold on blue stripes, was that they wanted something to denote soldiers, just like they had in World War II, the technical 5th grade, 4th grade, and 3rd grade. They wanted this specialist so that they could show soldiers who were technicians in their field without them wearing the same sort of stripes as everybody else. So they put in the specialist 3rd, 2nd, 1st, and the master specialist, which would then be changed in 1959 when they spun off the Air Force. All of the services redid their ranks because they went from 7 grades in the 50s into 1960 with the 9 grades that we know today. They still had the 2 with no insignia, and then they added the specialist 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And then they also added the sergeant first class right here, and they brought back the staff sergeant and the sergeant, and then they brought in the sergeant major and the specialist 9. So as we move into Vietnam, what you're going to see is they decided to get rid of the specialist 8 and specialist 9 because they just weren't really giving very many soldiers that rank anyways. So they get rid of it. And so these are much more similar to what we're used to seeing today. As we move forward into the 60s, then they add the command sergeant major in 1968. So they split the sergeant major, E9, into sergeant major and command sergeant major. And then this stays the same for almost 10 years when they drop the specialist 7. And there's just 3 specialist grades left. And they also added here in 1968 the private first class. So now we don't have but just one, the recruit private, that has no insignia, E1s. And so then moving forward from 1979 until 1984, then they add the command sergeant major of the Army with the 2 stars, the first insignia for that, of many that there will be. And then in 1985, they drop the specialist 6 and specialist 5, and just keep the specialist 4th grade, which is also known as just specialist, going forward. And so then in 1994, they change the insignia of the command sergeant major of the Army. They add the eagle insignia between the 2 stars and make the 2 stars much smaller. And then this is pretty much what we have today, except in 2006, the uniforms, the old green uniforms, changed, and they brought in the new blue dress uniforms. And of course, so they changed the tint of the stripes with the blue on the outside and the gold on the inside. And they made them slightly larger than they were before. But this is the basic 9 grades that we have today. So you have no insignia as a recruit, then you have private first class, corporal, and specialist at the E4, sergeant, staff sergeant, sergeant first class, master sergeant, and first sergeant at the E8, and then at E9 you have sergeant major, command sergeant major, and command sergeant major of the Army. All right, so this has been Cadet Rob 1985, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation on the progression of enlisted stripes in the United States Army.